The forest was silent, save for the soft crunch of leaves underfoot as the small group of mourners made their way through the trees. At the center of the procession was a white coffin carried by four solemn men. Their faces were etched with grief, their steps heavy with the weight of loss. Behind them walked a woman, her face pale and her eyes hollow, clutching a single red rose. She was the one who had loved him most, the one who had been left behind. The air was thick with sorrow, the kind that makes it hard to breathe. No one spoke. No one needed to. The coffin said it all. Inside lay David, a man whose life had been cut short too soon, a man who had been loved deeply and would be missed even more. As they moved deeper into the forest, the sky above began to darken, though no one noticed. Their focus was on the coffin, on the finality of the moment. But then, without warning, the silence was shattered. A deafening crack split the air, and a blinding bolt of lightning streaked down from the heavens. It struck the coffin with a force that sent the bearers stumbling backward, dropping it to the ground. For a moment, everything was still. The woman with the rose froze, her breath caught in her throat. The others stared in shock, their eyes wide with disbelief. And then slowly, the lid of the coffin began to move. The lid of the coffin creaked open, inch by inch, as if pushed by an unseen force. The mourners stood paralyzed, their hearts pounding in their chests. The woman with the rose took a hesitant step forward, her hand trembling as she reached out toward the coffin. Her mind raced, unable to process what was happening. Was this some cruel trick of nature, or something else entirely? Then a hand emerged from the coffin, a hand that moments ago had been lifeless. It gripped the edge of the lid, and slowly, David sat up. His eyes blinked open, dazed and confused, as if waking from a deep sleep. Gasps erupted from the group, and one of the bearers stumbled back, nearly falling to the ground. "David!" the woman whispered, her voice barely audible. She dropped the rose, her hands flying to her mouth. Tears streamed down her face, but they were no longer tears of grief. They were tears of shock, of hope, of something she couldn't yet name. David turned his head, his gaze locking onto hers. For a moment he seemed just as bewildered as everyone else. Then recognition flickered in his eyes. "Emily?" he croaked, his voice hoarse and weak. Emily rushed forward, collapsing to her knees beside the coffin. She reached out, touching his face as if to confirm he was real. "You're alive," she choked out, her voice breaking. How is this possible?" David shook his head, his expression a mix of wonder and confusion. "I don't know," he murmured. "I don't remember anything. Just darkness. And then light." The others began to gather around, their shock giving way to a mixture of awe and fear. One of the bearers crossed himself, muttering a prayer under his breath. Another simply stared, unable to speak. This was no ordinary event. This was something beyond their understanding. Emily helped David out of the coffin, her hands shaking as she supported him. He was unsteady on his feet, his body weak but very much alive. The group stood in a stunned silence, the weight of what had just happened settling over them like a heavy blanket. But as they began to process the miracle, questions started to arise. How had David come back to life? What did this mean? And what would happen next? The journey back through the forest was nothing short of surreal. David leaned heavily on Emily, his steps slow and unsteady, as if his body was still remembering how to function. The mourners followed in silence, their earlier grief replaced by a mix of wonder and unease. The coffin, now empty, was left behind in the clearing, a stark reminder of what had almost been. As they emerged from the forest and reached the small village where David and Emily lived, whispers began to spread like wildfire. Neighbors peered out from their windows, their faces filled with shock as they saw the man they had believed to be dead walking among them. Children pointed and stared, while others crossed themselves or muttered prayers. Emily led David to their small home, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. She helped him inside and onto the couch, her hands trembling as she draped a blanket over his shoulders. "Are you cold?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with urgency. David shook his head, though his body still shivered slightly. "I'm okay," he said, though his voice was weak. He looked around the room, his eyes lingering on familiar objects, the photographs on the wall, the books on the shelf, the quilt Emily had made for them. It was as if he was seeing them for the first time, or perhaps the last. Emily sat beside him, her hands clutching his. "David," she began, her voice breaking, "what happened to you? What do you remember?" David frowned, his brow furrowing as he tried to recall. "I remember pain," he said slowly. "And then nothing, just darkness. And then light, a bright, blinding light. And then I woke up." Emily's heart ached at the confusion in his voice. She wanted to ask more, to understand, but she could see the exhaustion in his eyes. "You should rest," she said gently. "We can talk more later." David nodded, leaning back against the couch. His eyes drifted shut, and within moments he was asleep. Emily sat there watching him, her mind a whirlwind of emotions: relief, joy, fear, and something else she couldn't quite name. She reached out, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead, her touch tender and full of love. But as she sat there, a thought began to creep into her mind, a thought she couldn't ignore. What if this wasn't permanent? What if David's return was only temporary? The fear of losing him again was almost too much to bear. The next few days were a blur. David's miraculous return became the talk of the village, and soon people from neighboring towns began to arrive, hoping to catch a glimpse of the man who had come back from the dead. Some came out of curiosity, others out of faith, and a few out of fear. The small house was constantly surrounded by onlookers, their whispers and murmurs a constant hum in the background. Emily did her best to shield David from the chaos. He was still weak, his body slowly recovering from whatever had happened to him. But the questions were relentless. Everyone wanted to know how he had come back to life. Was it a miracle, a sign from God, or something else entirely? David himself had no answers. He remembered nothing of the time between his death and his return. The doctors who examined him were baffled. His vital signs were normal. His body showed no signs of the illness that had claimed his life. And yet, there was no scientific explanation for what had happened. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the crowd outside began to thin, Emily sat with David in their small kitchen. The room was warm and cozy, the smell of freshly baked bread filling the air. But the atmosphere between them was heavy with unspoken questions. "David," Emily began hesitantly, do you think this is permanent? Or, or could you?" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. David reached across the table, taking her hand in his. His touch was warm, reassuring. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I do know this. I'm here now, and I'm not going to waste a single moment of it." Emily's eyes filled with tears and she squeezed his hand tightly. "I was so lost without you," she whispered. "I didn't know how to go on." David's expression softened, and he pulled her into his arms. "You're the strongest person I know," he said gently. "You would have found a way, but I'm glad I'm here to see it." As they sat there holding each other, a sense of peace settled over them. For the first time since his return, Emily allowed herself to hope, to believe that maybe, just maybe, this was a second chance for both of them. But the questions still lingered, and the world outside their door was growing louder. Soon they would have to face the reality of what had happened, and what it meant for their future. The days turned into weeks, and David's strength slowly returned. He began to help around the house again, chopping wood for the fire and tending to the small garden they had planted together. Life seemed to be returning to normal, but the shadow of the miracle still loomed over them. The villagers continued to whisper, and strangers still came from far and wide, hoping to witness the man who had cheated death. One morning, as Emily prepared breakfast, she felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She steadied herself against the kitchen counter, taking deep breaths until the feeling passed. It wasn't the first time this had happened. Over the past few days, she had been feeling unusually tired and queasy, but she had brushed it off as stress. Now, however, a thought occurred to her, one that made her heart race. She turned to David, who was sitting at the table, sipping a cup of tea. "David," she said slowly, her voice trembling, I think I might be pregnant." David froze, his cup halfway to his lips. He set it down carefully, his eyes wide with shock. "Pregnant?" he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily nodded, her hands instinctively moving to her stomach. I haven't been feeling well lately, and it just makes sense. I mean, we weren't exactly careful before. She trailed off, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. David stood up, crossing the room in a few quick strides. He took her hands in his expression a mixture of joy and disbelief. Emily, he said, his voice filled with emotion. This is, this is incredible. A baby. Our baby. Tears filled Emily's eyes as she looked up at him. But what if something happens? She whispered. What if this is all too much? What if... David shook his head, cutting her off. We'll take it one day at a time, he said firmly. We've been given a second chance, Emily. Both of us. And now we have this. A new life. A new beginning. Emily nodded, her tears spilling over. She leaned into him, resting her head against his chest. For the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, everything would be okay. But as they stood there, holding each other, a knock at the door interrupted the moment. Emily pulled away, wiping her tears as David went to answer it. Standing on the doorstep was a man Emily had never seen before. He was tall and thin, with sharp features and piercing eyes. David, the man said, his voice smooth but with an edge of curiosity. I've come a long way to meet you. I have questions. David exchanged a glance with Emily, his expression wary. Who are you? He asked. The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. My name is Dr. Elias Grant, he said, and I believe your story may hold the key to something extraordinary. Dr. Elias Grant stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his sharp eyes scanning the room as if searching for clues. Emily felt a chill run down her spine. There was something unsettling about the man, something that made her want to shield David from him. David, however, remained calm. What do you want? He asked, his voice steady but firm. Dr. Grant smiled again, that same cold smile. I'm a scientist, he said, specializing in phenomena that defy explanation. Your story has reached far and wide, David. A man returning from the dead? It's unprecedented. I'd like to understand how it happened. Emily stepped forward, her protective instincts kicking in. David's been through enough, she said firmly. He doesn't need to be treated like some kind of experiment. Dr. Grant turned his gaze to her, his expression unreadable. I understand your concern, he said smoothly. But this isn't just about David. This could change everything we know about life and death. Imagine the possibilities, the lives that could be saved. David shook his head. I don't remember anything, he said. I can't give you the answers you're looking for. Dr. Grant's smile faded, replaced by a look of determination. Perhaps not yet, he said, but with time and study, we might uncover something. I'd like to take you to my facility for further examination. Emily's heart raced. No, she said immediately. He's not going anywhere with you? David placed a hand on her arm, calming her. It's okay, he said softly. Then turning to Dr. Grant, he added, I appreciate your interest, but I'm not interested in being studied. I just want to live my life. Dr. Grant's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Emily thought he might argue. But then he nodded, though his expression remained cold. I understand, he said, but if you change your mind, you know where to find me. He handed David a business card, then turned and left without another word. Emily watched him go, her unease growing. I don't trust him, she said once the door was closed. Neither do I, David admitted. But we can't let him or anyone else control our lives. We have to focus on what's important. Emily nodded, her hand instinctively moving to her stomach. You're right, she said. We have so much to look forward to. But as the days passed, Dr. Grant's visit lingered in their minds. The world outside was still watching, still waiting for answers, and Emily couldn't shake the feeling that their peaceful life was about to be disrupted once again. Weeks turned into months, and Emily's pregnancy became more evident. The nausea had subsided, replaced by a glow that seemed to radiate from within. David doted on her, his love and gratitude evident in every gesture. The miracle of his return had brought them closer than ever, and the anticipation of their child's arrival filled their home with hope and joy. But the outside world had not forgotten. Dr. Grant's visit had been the first of many. Reporters, scientists, and even religious leaders came knocking, each with their own agenda. Some wanted to study David, others wanted to worship him, and a few simply wanted to exploit his story for their own gain. David and Emily did their best to maintain their privacy, but the constant attention was exhausting. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Emily turned to David with a determined look. "We can't keep living like this," she said. "We need to leave. Start over somewhere no one knows us." David nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking the same thing," he admitted. "But where would we go?" Emily smiled, a spark of excitement in her eyes. "Somewhere quiet, somewhere peaceful, maybe near the mountains or by the sea. Just somewhere we can be ourselves." David reached out, taking her hand in his. "Then that's what we'll do," he said firmly. "We'll leave as soon as we can." The decision brought them a sense of relief they hadn't felt in months. They began to make plans, quietly packing their belongings and saying goodbye to the few friends they trusted. The night before they were set to leave, Emily stood in the doorway of their home, looking out at the stars. David joined her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "Nervous?" he asked. Emily shook her head. "Not nervous," she said. "Hopeful. This feels like the start of something new. For us, and for our baby." David smiled, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "It is," he said, "and no matter what happens, we'll face it together." The next morning they left before the sun rose, their car packed with everything they owned. As they drove away from the village, Emily felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, she felt free. Months later, in a small cottage by the sea, their daughter was born. She had David's eyes and Emily's smile, and as they held her for the first time, they knew their lives had been forever changed. The miracle of David's return had given them a second chance, but the birth of their child was a reminder that life was full of miracles, big and small. Together they had faced loss, heartbreak, and the unknown, and they had emerged stronger, more grateful, and more in love than ever. As they watched the sun set over the ocean, their daughter sleeping peacefully in Emily's arms, David turned to her and smiled. "This is our new beginning," he said. Emily nodded, her heart full. "And it's only the start."
Subscribe and press the bell icon so that you never miss the amazing video.